So welcome to the briefing, to our September briefing on Internet governance and digital policy. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Stephanie Borg-Psaila. I'm the Interim Director of DiploFoundation, while the Director, Jovan Kurbalja, is working for a few months as the newly launched UN panel on high-level panel on digital cooperation. We'll go the way that we're structuring the briefing, as usual, is as follows. We'll go through the events that took place in September. Then we'll look at the developments and a few key trends that we've identified based on the digital policy developments that took place in September. And then we'll take a look at what to expect in the coming weeks. But before we look at the events, I'd like to introduce here a few colleagues assisting us for today's briefing. So we have Davide here and Marco and Darwin in the background. Marco will be the bridge between the online participants and us here in the room. And we also have today two guests. They're Diplo's in-house experts on cybersecurity and on e-commerce. So I'd like to introduce, you can see them tiny there on the screen, Vladimir Radunovic, our cybersecurity expert. He'll be talking a little bit about one of the trends related to cybersecurity. And we also have Marilia Maciel, our expert on e-commerce, who will also be talking about another one of the trends related to, and can immediately say this related to the WTO modernization. So there were quite a few discussions there, and we'll tackle that. At the end of the briefing, for those online, please don't disconnect when we come to the end of our when I come to the end of my presentation here, because then our online participants will be able to see the regional development. And Vladimir will take you through the regional developments one by one. So introductions ready. We'll start with the events that took place in September. And maybe we can enlarge the image here for us here in situ. Thank you. Quite a few events in September. Some of them still have to take place. It's only the 25th, so there's a week to go of events, and there are some events taking place even here, even at this moment, at the Paix related to digital rights. So from the list of our events, of the main events in September, I'll just highlight a couple of them. The first is the 39th session of the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council tackled several reports. One of them was the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the report refers to the right to privacy and responsibilities of the states and of businesses. I don't know if you've seen the report, if you've read it. Quite an interesting report. It looks at the global trends related to the interference of the right to privacy. And it tackles also the responsibilities, as I was saying, of states and businesses. So it links the responsibilities of states to the International Human Rights Framework, and it links the responsibilities of businesses to a 2011 document called the Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights. So that's the first event, still ongoing at the Paix here in Geneva. I think there are voting taking place Thursday and Friday, if I'm not mistaken. So the Human Rights Council is still going on. A second event from the list behind me is the face-to-face, the first meeting of the UN high-level panel on digital cooperation. So I mentioned this at the beginning, and this is the first meeting between the panel members. There will also be the secretariat. They are meeting at the moment in New York, and one of the key outputs, let's say, of the meeting, one of the things that we can expect from this meeting is that the panel will identify the focus areas that it will be working on. So I think we're quite curious to see what the focus areas will be. I don't know, we have Jovan actually online. It's early for New York, but maybe if he's online, Jovan, you're welcome to share any updates from New York. So the rest of the events, as I was saying, are still to take place. We will now look at the developments that took place in September. As always, a busy month, and we'll look at a few of the key developments through the eyes of our barometer. So the barometer indicates the prominence of IG issues this month in comparison to the previous month. And as you will see, there are 3 slides there on the barometer. The most prominent issues were related to security, e-commerce, digital rights, and jurisdiction. And we'll see in a little bit why these were so prominent. I'll just pick a few developments, just go through them, and then we'll move on to the trends. So I'm picking them. They are important, not saying that they are the most important. Other developments are also important, but I'll just mention the right to be forgotten for those following the case. The case, the Google and the French data protection regulator, the case continues at the Court of Justice of the EU. So the court, let's say the case dates back to 2015, 2016, and let me share a timeline on the right to be forgotten. So we know that there was the judgment in 2014, which proclaimed that, which stated that users had the right to request certain search results to be delisted. And in 2016, Google extended the rule to European search engines such as Google.fr, and to global sites accessed within the country where the request was made. But the problem was that the CNIL, which is the French data protection authority, asked Google to delist the search results globally. So it asked to extend the rule to a global level. And this is where the court, the case was brought in front of the Court of Justice of the EU, and it is tackling 3 specific questions. And the questions are the following. Should delisting apply globally? So should Google or search engines apply the delisting across all the sites? And if not, should, I'll combine second and third question that the court is tackling, should the delisting apply only to the domain name corresponding to the country where the request was made? For example, if the request is made in France, then should the listing be via Google.fr only? And should the search engine also use geo-blocking and apply the listing in any EU member state, regardless of which version of the Google search engine the person was using? Now, the issue surrounding this case, and by the way, the court heard, I think, over 70 submissions in the space of 7 hours, so the judges were busy there. The concern about this case is mostly if the court decides that the delisting should take place globally. The concerns are the following. If it's ruled in this way, it means that an EU law, an EU decision would be applied globally. And that can create conflict of laws. And the second main, let's say, concern related to this is that it would encourage other states, other countries, or other regions to follow the same thinking. So if the EU applies its rule globally, what prevents other countries beyond the EU shores from doing the same, from applying their own decision in a global way? So for those following the court case, the submissions were heard, and now we're expecting the opinion of the Advocate General, which should be out in about 2 to 4 months. And the decision is expected sometime in 2019. So that was the first important development. A second one relates to copyright. So the European Parliament voted on Articles 11 and 13. So the so-called snippet tax and the so-called upload filter. There were a few changes to the draft, but I would say the changes were cosmetic. So the essence of both these controversial articles was retained. Article 11, I can very quickly go into them. Article 11, the snippet tax, says that first of all, what is a snippet? When you run a search for any term, for anything, the snippet is that description that is right below the title or the heading. So you'd have in a search result the heading, the short description or the snippet, and then the hyperlink embedded. So it's the snippet which is it's the snippet which is at the center of Article 11. Again, it's the essence of Article 11 is retained, and basically what this article is saying is that the platforms that show these search results need to pay the newspapers for publishing these snippets. So there is a right of remuneration for the publishers. Pros and cons to both articles, to both so position pro and against. But it's basically the Parliament voted in favor of even the small changes for this article. Article 13 is the upload filter rule, which states that internet platforms would need to filter the content, and this relates to copyright infringement, would need to filter users' content before publishing that content. So they would need to be also proactive in with the right holders to identify first the copyrighted material. Again, Article 13 voted on, so we'll see what happens in the trilogues, and a vote is expected in spring 2019. Another update, again from the EU. European Commission has proposed new rules to help ensure that terrorist content is swiftly removed. So it imposed a 1-hour deadline from the notification by the competent authority. So it is basically, these proposed rules are basically saying, as soon as the platforms receive the notification of the content, they need to remove that within 1 hour. And we see with this development a little bit of a departure from the approach that the Commission had in the past, because the Commission, the approach was that of the voluntary self-regulation, but it's now saying it's time to put this as a legally binding rule. Another observation on this, on these proposed rules, is the fact that the platforms, although there is the deadline, and the deadline is quite strict, 1 hour, but there is the notification by the competent authorities there. So rather than saying they have to be proactive and find the content, scan for the content, filter for the content, and then remove it, the 1 hour is from the notification by the authorities. So that's the third development there. There are a lot more developments, as you can see on the barometer behind me. There are a few headlines, a few headings listing all the developments. We covered them in more detail on the observatory and obviously in the newsletter, which we publish every end of the month. And this month it will be available by the end of the week. So all the other important developments, you'll find the summaries of them on in the newsletter. And now we can move to look at the trends. And we identified 3 trends based on a few, again, important developments that took place in September. And these trends, I'll just highlight them and then we'll go into each one of them. The trends relate to cybersecurity, data governance, and as I mentioned earlier, the WTO modernization discussions. So let's start by tackling cybersecurity. And as we have seen from 2 documents published by the US, White House and Pentagon on cyber strategies, there is a push towards offensive operations. So again, these 2 documents, the first is the cyber strategy of the White House, first strategy in 15 years. I don't know if you've read the strategy, but one observation is that economy and security considerations are very much linked together. First of all, the strategy specifies this directly, so it's quite clear there. But this interplay between the economy and the security emerges in issues that are covered by the strategy, like, for example, data flows or the theft of trade secrets. So you see the interplay between these economic and security interests, which emerge quite strongly, I would say, in the strategy. The other document comes from the Pentagon, and it's an update of the 2015 cyber strategy. The difference, and here is where I will call Vlada in a few moments, difference is that the new cyber strategy, the 2018, uses, let's say, a bit more aggressive words. For example, it uses the word prepare for war. So it calls on the military to prepare for war, and it also uses the term defense forward. In a moment, I'll ask Vlada to tell us a little bit more about the difference in the stance between these 2 documents. And going back to the White House strategy, there is also an initiative. It's called the Cyber Deterrence Initiative, and there also we're curious to see whether this cyber deterrence, whether it is the first time that it is mentioned in an official document. So I'll stop there and I'll call Vlad at this stage to share a few thoughts about the change in, let's say, tone between these 2 strategies from the Pentagon and this cyber deterrence notion in the White House strategy. Do we have Vlada?
Hi, Steph. Good afternoon, everyone. I can literally
Hi,
the stage.
Yes,
Can you see me? Okay. Yeah. I can't literally walk the stage, but I can try to be somewhere closer to you, at least a little bit. Thank you, Steph, for a good introduction. I'll try to reflect briefly on these 2 things. So one is the overall change, I wouldn't even say a change, an update in the position of the US. So US has for years been more and more towards active defense in a way. Now, what is different when it comes to the new DoD strategy and the whole set of things, we have to see the strategy in the context of all the other moves, which is the elevation of the U.S. Cyber Command to a fully unified combatant command, and then the reversal of the Obama's limits on the use of cyber weapons, and now the cyber policy as well, where in a way we can see, and it has been said, I think, in also by the head of the U.S. Cyber Command, that the U.S. sees that the other actors are not sitting and enjoying peaceful time, but they're constantly operating. So in a way, what we can describe the U.S. position now is some sort of persistent engagement, that they're not going to be waiting for the war. They're going to be constantly engaged in a state of war, in a way, even though most of that will be underneath the threshold of the armed attack and the warfare as such. When it comes to specifically the DoD strategy, we see this, as you mentioned, more strict language. If we look into the previous one in 2015, we have seen most of this already. Nothing of this is really new, except for it is more explicit, and you're right, it is a bit more sharp. For instance, now we see this term of defend forward, which, how they describe it, is sort of a activity of the DoD to actually penetrate into other systems, to either look or understand, as they say, understand the adversaries better, or even disrupt or halt the malicious cyber activity before they happen in the sources, which means in other countries, in the systems of other countries, something that we might call preemptive strikes in the cyber area. At least that's how I see it, which we have seen before, probably informally. This is the first time we see it formally in a document, and it goes a little bit against what we saw as sort of discussion on the US level on a more open and transparent use of the vulnerabilities in order to penetrate other systems. The other interesting thing in this whole setting is more and more visibility, or more and more presence of what they call online mulling influence and information campaigns, non-state propaganda, disinformation, sort of what happened when it comes to the elections and so on, which is quite interesting. In the previous years, basically, the US has been the one defining cybersecurity as not information security. So information security was something different. The focus was on systems. The Russian and Chinese and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization were more bringing that together, the information security as a broader, and then network security, cybersecurity as a part of that. Now we are seeing sort of a convergence, which is quite an interesting effect of the recent years. So maybe the definition will change or come closer. And then quickly on your question on deterrence, it is now a hot topic. It will be for some years, definitely. Deterrence is not new, even in these cyber discussions. On a military level, there's been a lot of discussions on deterrence, which should be seen as sort of a perception, basically, in two ways. One is to increase the costs of the attacks. So if someone dares to attack, they should be ready to understand that the costs of that attacks will be bigger. And secondly, of course, reducing the likelihood of a success of attack. If you look at the DoD strategy in 2015, we already see that they were basically calling for a comprehensive cyber deterrence strategy. Now we are seeing the same thing, where we see more of the emphasis, not so much on denial and resilience, which is sort of a network security and being able to bring the system back after the attack, but more on the response. So how US is going to respond, which includes the attribution as well, to be able to understand and clearly attribute the attack to someone, how the US is going to respond. And in that regards, the cyber strategy brings this International Cyber Deterrence Initiative, which is quite an interesting approach. It goes hand in hand with what the US has been talking about after the failed GG in 2017, that they want to focus on implementing the norms and the consequences if someone doesn't obey to the norms, the voluntary norms. So basically, this is a call to put up a coalition of like-minded, as they like to say, the US, to share intelligence, to establish and share attribution about the attack, and to implement the consequences. That means, and they clearly say it in the documents, the consequences could be diplomatic, military as well, financial, intelligence, public attribution, blame, shame, law enforcement, and so on. So it's not necessarily just a military response, but they're raising it to a higher level. So to conclude, what we are seeing is the emergence of the term deterrence, meaning consequences in the broader cyber policy area.
Thank you, Vlada. Thanks. And you also mentioned, Vlada, the reversal of the Presidential Policy Directive 20. And in fact, this reversal of the rules, which, by the way, as far as I know, are still classified, it will give the Department of Defense more flexibility versus how things were in the past. We'll now move on to the second strand, which relates to data governance. So there is still an intensification of discussions regarding data governance. So on one hand, free flow of data, and on the other hand, data localization. And the reason for this intensification of discussions is the new e-commerce draft law in India. It's making quite let's say noise, because the discussions are still polarized. So we're seeing both these positions being let's say elaborated in various forums. So we're seeing a lot of discussions on online, for example, but also in India, it's most probably what we're seeing in India. Most probably it will continue to trickle, and the discussions, I don't think that we'll see them calm down quite soon. And I think we can say that the discussions are quite polarized because of these two quite distinct positions, so free flow and data localization. There are pro and con arguments for both, so the positions are quite elaborated, but there is still no, let's say, common ground for these two positions. And what we have seen in these recent discussions is that one of the key, what we feel is a key issue to be discussed, and which is not so pronounced, is that related to the ownership of data. So when talking about data governance, ownership of data, who owns the data at the various stages, is something that is not so much, not as discussed probably as it should. There are some discussions focusing on this, but when you compare them to discussions on, for example, monetization of data, the question of ownership is still quite at the beginning. When I say ownership of data, it literally means who owns, first of all, my data. When I still have it, that's easy, it's me. But then what happens to the data? Who owns it once I pass it on to a company, to a platform in return for the service that I get? Am I ceding my ownership? Is it just the possession of data that is changing? So who owns the data at that stage? And then when the companies they add let's say a layer of analysis, then the resulting data, so you have two sets of data there, the underlying and the resulting data, who owns each of those at the different stages. In these discussions, what perhaps is not again as pronounced as it should be, is that when we talk about data, here in this example I refer to personal data, but in reality there are so many different types of data. So probably the discussion should also factor these different types of data in wherever this is all being discussed. So that's on data governance, and in the newsletter, in the September newsletter, I can reveal that we'll be looking at the different arguments, the arguments for the free flow of data and the arguments for localization, just to have a mapping of these two, let's say, strong positions. And with that, we'll move to the third trend about the WTO modernization, and especially a proposal coming from the EU Commission. So it made quite specific suggestions, and there was also mention of the modernization of the WTO in the G20 ministers' discussions in Argentina. And it's here that I call in Marilia to tell us more about what the European Commission's proposal on WTO modernization is suggesting, and what did the G20 ministers say in their meeting. Marilia?
Thank you, Stefan. Good afternoon to everyone. Indeed, it has been a very difficult year for the WTO, and the situation is quite delicate. As you remember, probably in the ministerial meeting last year in December in Buenos Aires, the discussions were very polarized, and member countries almost did not manage to produce a final declaration. This was produced last minute. And since then, the discussions have not moved forward very smoothly. There are several negotiations that are currently stalled. And in addition to that, the appellate body has some vacant seats that need to be filled in. And the process of filling in these seats is taking a very long time. And the appellate body is really a cornerstone of the organization, of the dispute settlement mechanism of the organization, and the effectiveness of the WTO as a whole. So it's very important that the seats are filled soon. So many countries are discussing what they could do to modernize the WTO and in a way to bring the trading system up to speed to the changes that are happening so fast in the world economy. And the European Union has presented a proposal this week. This proposal has been put forward under the request of the European Council, and it's a very robust proposal. In more than 40 pages, they explain what needs to be modernized in the WTO, and the proposals can be clustered on the three main areas. The first of them is a topic that is in the agenda for a long time, which is the modernization of the rule book of the WTO to make it more consistent with the digital economy today. Many of the norms of the WTO have been written in a time that the traditional trade of goods and services usually took place offline, and this has completely changed today. The part of the commerce that takes place online is increasing every year, and the rules are somehow not very in accordance with this new reality. There are themes that need to be discussed by member countries. E-commerce is one of them. As you may remember, member states tried to start a negotiation on e-commerce last year, but they did not receive a mandate to do it in a ministerial conference in Buenos Aires. And a part of the members are currently engaged in a plurilateral discussion to try to see what could be the terms of a treaty on e-commerce. So the update of the rule book, it's one important point that the European Commission says that needs to be taken care of. The second one is strengthening the monitoring power of the WTO and making the rules more transparent. And although there's no clear reference to China, we know that this is a concern that is underlying Europe and the United States as well in this regard. And China offers many subsidies, and particularly there is a connection between the private companies and the state that is concerning for member states, because I believe that this is highly distortive of trade and gives a competitive advantage to Chinese companies. So they would like to see these subsidies made clear, more transparent, and to make sure of what is forbidden and what is not. So transparency and monitoring is another pillar of the proposal that has been advanced by the Commission. And the third one is related to the appellate body. So they would like to see changes, and they would like to see the filling in of the seats that are vacant. And because in these moments that we see disputes, trade wars, unilateral measures being put in place by different states, it's very important that we have a dispute settlement system that works and it's effective. So they would like to see changes being introduced to the appellate body and to the dispute settlement system. Certainly, all these topics will be discussed next week, and I would like to leave an invitation for those in Geneva to take part in the WTO public forum that will take place in the WTO next week. There will be several sessions related to these issues. Last year, almost half of the program was dedicated to digital commerce, and we expect the same to happen this year as well. So those in Geneva, probably, if you are interested on the topic, you could participate in this meeting. Diplo will be hosting a session together with the Commonwealth and ACP organizations. It will be on Thursday at 8:30, so you are more than invited to come and take part on this session. But the issues in the WTO have not only been discussed by member states in the context of the organization. It's interesting to see that several regional groupings, clusters have presented declarations supporting the trading system and multilateral solutions to the problem that we see in trade today. This month, it was the turn of the G20 to pronounce itself. So the ministers of trade and finance have issued a final declaration. And among the topics that they tackle, they do emphasize very strongly that the WTO needs to be reformed and measures need to be put in place swiftly to make sure that the WTO continues to be this body, this mechanisms offering this framework in which countries have operated for growth and development and prosperity with regards to trade like in the last years. And so the G20 is backing a swift addressing of the problems that the WTO is facing today. But before the G20, other mechanisms have also mentioned the importance to reform the multilateral trading system. China is also supporting the proposal. The IMF has issued a declaration in months before. So there is a movement going on, and we expect to see some changes in the months to come. Thanks, Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, Marilia. And maybe we can add that the commissions by the proposals by the European Commission are viewed by many as a way to tackle the U.S. concerns at the WTO, and especially after we know that the U.S. has threatened to pull out of the WTO. So that's a little bit for context. And this brings us to the end of the part on trends. And it's here that I think we'll open the floor for comments here in Geneva, and comments online. And we have the mic, Richard, as always. So can I please ask you to just state the name before making your comment?
Richard Hill, yeah, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I have several comments. They're not all related. So you mentioned the EU now has these various new copyright rules and anti-terror initiatives and so on. So that strikes me as being a rather abrupt shift from no regulation, which is what you mentioned, to, sorry to be blunt, stupid regulation. Because I think these regulations are completely idiotic. I think we do need regulation. I just don't think we need those particular ones. But I think that's true in the history of technology. When new technology comes in, first governments don't do anything, and then they react and they do something stupid, and then they figure it out, and slowly it gets reasonable. So I think we're just in that phase. Legislators are now realizing, oh, well, we can't just leave this to itself, and eventually they'll figure out something reasonable. So I think it's positive in the long term, even though it's not right in the short term.
Richard, just to clarify, you're referring to the copyright?
Everything you mentioned, the takedown notice for terrorism, the copyright, and
even terrorism.
Yeah. I mean, come on. You know, come on. Free speech means that you have due process before you take something down. Here's some policeman somewhere says, I think that's terrorist, and they have to take it down in an hour. That's a violation of free speech. And I think eventually the European Court of Human Rights may or may not look at that and throw it out. We'll see. Plus, nobody has ever proven yet that this stuff on the internet actually is responsible for violent acts, etc. Let's not go there. Now, the cyber strategy, you didn't mention one bit that's particularly interesting, I thought, in the Trump administration statement. It talks about internet governance, and it favors the multi-stakeholder model, which the U.S. has long been doing nothing new there. But then it actually says that the four components, civil society, governments, private sector, on an equal footing. Yeah. Now, that's the first time that's come out in an official pronouncement of the U.S. government. Larry Strickling used to say that in his speeches, but it was never an official statement. Now it's an official statement. And I'm not sure they realize what that means, because, of course, that means then they cannot do e-commerce in the World Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization is definitely not multi-stakeholder. And much of the e-commerce stuff is, in fact, internet governance stuff. So either they're defining internet governance in a very narrow way, or they're being contradictory. But I think with the Trump administration, probably contradiction is not held to be a problem. In terms of WTO modernization, as they're now calling it, I'll be very blunt. From my point of view and that of my colleagues who are going to be there in force next week, this is just an attempt to formalize the domination of the WTO and the economic interests of the G20 and of developed countries against developing countries. It's basically an attempt to kill the Doha agenda, which they cannot do in the formal WTO setting. And so that's, I think, going to be recognized by the developing countries, and it will either lead to a WTO which is just G20 or to a total collapse. We will see. Then you mentioned the extraterritorial effects of the right to be forgotten. And people are, and the GDPR, and people are sort of going, oh my God, This is brand new. We've never had this before. I mean, I'm sorry. Lots of law is applied extraterritorially. Almost all, or many jurisdictions anyway, apply criminal law extraterritorially. If you harm a citizen of Switzerland, you can be pursued in Switzerland. If a Swiss citizen does something criminal outside of Switzerland, he can be pursued in Switzerland. So there are vast bodies of law which are extraterritorial. Tort law also, if you're defamed, you can have extraterritorial effects. So it's not particularly new. What's new is that now it's hitting the internet, whereas before it didn't, because again, we were in this no regulation mode. And I'll just close with an interesting example of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Some of you know that there's this investigation going on as to whether or not people in the U.S. colluded with Russia. They're using the word collusion. It's actually conspiracy to influence the U.S. elections. And the special prosecutor is called Mueller. He's indicted, I forget how many, I think it's 12 or 13 Russians who are held by him to be agents of the Russian intelligence service, GRU, and to have done certain things to influence the Russian elections while they were in Russia. So he's saying, oh, these guys in Russia did this, that, and the other thing. And in the indictment, he actually gives, he doesn't give proof, but they cite, they say, okay, on this date, this person sent this email to this other person. And so that shows, well, it's an extraterritorial effect because these were acts committed in Russia by Russian citizens, which are now being alleged to be crimes in the U.S. But more interestingly, it shows that somebody, I think the CIA or the NSA, somehow penetrated the Russian intelligence service because they're reading these guys' emails. And so I would argue that the U.S. already has put into place offensive action, at least to some extent, against at least the intelligence services of other countries.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. We'll tackle a few points. Let's just hear a few other comments, and then we'll come back to the at least two of the points that you mentioned. Other comments from the room? No comments. All right. You're uncontested so far, Richard. Well, let's see whether we have any comments from online.
Yes, there was a lively discussion online. We have a couple of questions and a couple of comments as well. Foncham, if I pronounce it correctly, please apologies, is talking regarding the developments, in particular the EU Copyright Directive. Is asking how will they ensure that the removal of contents does not compromise freedom of expression online, considering that it may be very difficult to clearly identify terrorist contents. And then a couple of questions and remarks also, I think they're addressed to Vlada and Marilia, but I'll make them also present here for the audience in Geneva. One of them is from Aida. She had a comment saying that news just came out that the UK intelligence agency admitted unlawfully spying on the Privacy International collecting agency and as examining them as a part of its bulk communications data and bulk personal dataset programs. And Crystal as well, she made us notice that there was another development from China that was not included in our review, which concerns mainly there is the new top internet official lays out an agenda for party control online. And the last comment is from Romina to Marilia, I guess, or to Stephanie, whoever wants to pick it up. She's asking, what are the new perspectives of the business model with the introduction of artificial intelligence in electronic commerce?
Okay. So let's see whether there are more comments in the room. Meanwhile, yes, and we'll give the... no, I think you can go ahead.
Yeah?
Yes, you can go ahead now.
Because in case we hear some more fierce criticisms about the...
Let's see. No, let's see. But I mean, what we're doing here is basically seeing what the main positions are. So it's not, I mean, seeing one, seeing the. Mm-hmm.
Didn't hear me.
Okay, so on the copyright directive, I would like to reply to the question about safeguarding the freedom of expression. What safeguards exist in the copyright directive? First of all, the measures don't target users, but service providers which store large amounts of content, third-party copyright content. Second of all, there is a requirement that no proactive monitoring is allowed. And thirdly, there are redress mechanisms. So if a content is removed, then the users have a possibility to appeal from this decision and have the content re-uploaded. I would like also to go back to the general comment about the stupidity of EU legislation to address new issues such as copyright or removal of content. First of all, these issues are not new because we have the legislative framework already since years and we are modernizing it. And each time we modernize the copyright rules, it's always very heated debate, which is on one hand understandable from human rights perspective, but we also should not be naive that there are today huge commercial interests involved in this area. And the EU is actually very explicit and very honest on this, because the objectives of the changes are to rebalance the bargaining power between the right holders on one hand and big online platforms which exploit their content. And that's the decision that has been taken at political level. And one more general comment that I would like to make on this, whether this is thought through or not. We always have public consultations, we have impact assessments, and the legislative process takes a long time and is open to all stakeholders to get involved. So I really hope that there are safeguards and that everybody's opinion is taken into account.
Thank you, Kasia. Thank you. Are there any more comments here? And online? No. All right. I'll just make a few comments related to what you both said, but I'll leave the WTO and the issue of transparency. I don't know whether Marilia has any comments on that. You're right, Richard. It does. The document does mention for the first time equal footing, so that's quite important there. With regards to the regulation and versus the freedom of speech, there's a delicate balance there, obviously. Now, we all have to remember that the platforms have been asked many times before to react, and very quickly. The question is whether that has been satisfying the government and whether the internet space is safer after all the takedowns that there were or not. It is true. I mean, when the governments feel that self-regulation is not working, then regulation comes in. It's not to say that it will work, but let's say we've been seeing the pushes and we've been seeing the calls. For example, there's the GA at the moment. In last year's General Assembly, you may recall Theresa May and a few other heads of state, they did make the push again. So probably regulation comes after a lot of you have to do this, you have to do this. At the end of this process, I think that is where regulation. So it is let's say there's a balance between leaving it up to the companies and up to the platforms to remove content which is worrisome, and at the same time the responsibility of the states to then draw the line. When should the line be drawn? That is a very big question mark. So this is combining, Richard, your comment and Kasia's comment. I don't know whether Marilia has any comments about the transparency of the WTO. Thank you for bringing that up. It is a controversial aspect. Also, not sure whether when the equal footing was added there, not sure whether there was also the consideration of the WTO. I'm almost sure that it wasn't the case, but you added that when you were describing that. So, all right. Fonchem also asked how can content which is not illegal, how can content which does not infringe copyright not be removed by mistake? Well, that is $1 million question, because at the moment let's say that the measures that the platforms, that the companies are putting forward, by mistake, some content actually gets removed. It is not 100%, let's say, perfect measure, but this is what the companies tell us continuously that they're working for. They're working on algorithms and AI and whatnot. So I hope that replies to Foncham's question. I don't know whether there are any more comments here in the room. No, online? All right, we haven't heard from Marilia, so we'll leave it at that. And I think we'll move on to see what we can expect in October. Obviously, more of these discussions, so the trends, there is quite a strong indication that issues related to WTO and data governance, for example, they will continue to stay with us in the short term. In October, Marilia already mentioned the panel that we will have during the WTO Public Forum. I'm not seeing it on the list. It's on the next slide. So someone saw it already. Thank you. That's on the 4th of October. We'll be reporting from the WTO, so we will have just-in-time reporting for those who are interested in seeing very quickly what the discussions are about. So we'll have the report, as usual, from digital policy-related sessions within a few hours from the end of the session. If we can go back one slide to see again the, thank you, the events in October, ICANN 63rd meeting towards the end of October. And I'll just mention the first one. It's the, again, UN high-level panel on digital cooperation. This time, it's a virtual town hall meeting. So it's online. There are, if I'm not mistaken, 2 slots where we can all participate. One is in the morning CET time, CEST time, and the other one, it's in the evening. So that covers the event in October, and this is where I'll explain very, very quickly what we have in store, the GIP and Diplo in October. So again, the panel, WTO I mentioned, newsletter I mentioned. We have an event on cyber mediation and the role of blockchain and artificial intelligence here in Geneva, but also online for those who would like to follow that. We have a course, it's based, it's for Geneva-based diplomats and digital policy practitioners, starting 9 of October, still a few places left. So if that interests you, please let me know after the briefing. And an event together with the EU delegation and the Austrian mission on the GDPR, and that's taking place 10th October. You'll see the event, I think it is already on Facebook, but we'll have it also on our website. It's in situ only, but we'll have the report after the event for those who are unable to join us. And I think that brings us at the end of our briefing here in Geneva. So thank you for a very lively discussion and for bringing up some interesting points there. There's a question or a comment? Yes, sure. Mike, 1 second. Can you introduce yourself for our online colleagues?
Hello everyone, I'm Major from I'm sorry. Should I start again? Yeah. Okay. I'm Vera Major from ICANN, and as Stephanie kindly mentioned, we're holding our Barcelona meeting at the end of October. We're also holding a briefing in Geneva on the 4th, right after the WTO session closes at 1:30 p.m. at Maison de la Paix. You're all welcome to come. It's in auditorium A2. And we are going to talk about the high-level meeting that we're going to have in Barcelona. We're also going to talk about the updates on the GDPR and the WHOIS, as well as the new GTLD processes and the auction monies. So I have flyers at the end of the meeting if you want. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for telling us about the event on the 4th of October. All right, so we're wrapping up here, but not for our online colleagues. So online colleagues, we invite you to stay on because Vlada will take you through the regional developments that took place in September. And with this, I thank you all for joining us today. Do download the newsletter that will be available at the end of the month, and see you again for the October briefing on digital policy. Thank you.
Thanks to Stephanie, Marilia, and Vlada for roundup of developments. For our online participants, now have regional updates, so please stay with us. First, we will hear from Grace with updates from the Africa continent.
Welcome to Updates from Africa, where this month more countries imposed taxes on telephone and internet services for varying reasons. In Benin, advocacy groups are calling for abolishment of taxes on over-the-top services after the president passed a decree in August requiring users to pay about 0.08 US cents per megabyte of data used in what is being termed as open internet services, or services that the government does not collect taxes from. Similarly, Zambia passed a policy of taxing users for social media and internet communication platforms such as WhatsApp, Facebook, and Viber. The government says that the tax of about 3 US cents per day will boost government revenue and also protects local telcos. And then in Kenya, the government introduced an excise duty of 15% for telephone and internet data services. The president explained that this revenue was needed to fund government priority programs in manufacturing, food and nutrition, security, and universal healthcare. In other developments, Cameroon was cited for internet shutdowns during the 39th session of the Human Rights Council at the UN. The country, which last year had a long internet shutdown of about 100 days in English-speaking regions, was urged to promote freedoms of expression, assembly, and association online, even as it heads to elections next month. And in Niger, experts have raised concerns about the US plans to expand its armed drone mission in that country. Earlier this year, a report of the Africa Commission on Human and People's Rights called for independent investigations on death of civilian populations from armed drones deployed by the US. Niger suffers from terrorist attack and organized crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Those were updates from Africa. We see new taxes for internet use. And now we will hear from Sita Lakshmi with an Asian update, especially on the ASEAN country meetings.
Hi, greetings from Jakarta. I would like to update you two key issues being discussed prominently in ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in September. First is about World Economic Forum, which was held in Hanoi this month. Theme for this event was ASEAN 4.0, Entrepreneurship and the Fourth Industrial Revolutions. It has attracted more than 1,100 participants and attended by high-level officials from ASEAN countries. One of the key initiatives being highlighted was Digital ASEAN. It focuses on 6 areas, and among them are harmonizing data policy and governance rules in ASEAN, upgrading broadband access quality and speed, and building a pan-regional e-payment ecosystem. At the end of the forum, Google announced it's deepening its commitment to train 3 million small-medium enterprises workers in digital skills by 2020. The second I would like to talk is about the cybersecurity in ASEAN. Deputy Prime Minister Singapore, Mr. Teo Jay Hian, announced the establishment of ASEAN Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence during Singapore International Cyber Week this month. Deputy Prime Minister started his announcement by first stating the most serious data breach Singapore had recently, affecting personal data of 1.5 million healthcare patients, including the Prime Minister of Singapore. The center will expand on the existing ASEAN Cyber Capacity Program, 10 million Singaporean dollar investment that Singapore has made in 2016. Convened in the same week, the third ASEAN Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity was also held. The Ministerial Conference is a follow-up after a direction given by ASEAN leaders in April. In the chairman's statement, the ministers stated their support of the recommendation regarding norms set out in the 2015 report of the United Nations Groups of Government Experts, or UNGGE, on developments in the field of information telecommunications in the context of international security. That's for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Silvia. That was Sita with updates from Asia continent, especially on Asia ASEAN meetings held last month. Thanks, Sita. Now we will hear Wanda Perez with updates from the Caribbean region.
Hello, my fellows. Once again reporting from the Caribbean, Wanda Perez. Under an historic public-private partnership arrangement, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines decided to collaborate in the build-out of their broadband infrastructure, contracting Digicel to undertake the work. The signing of the contracts will take place this month on Wednesday 26th during the Caribbean Telecommunications Union's ICT Week St. Kitts and Nevis. These broadband network build-outs constitute key elements of the Caribbean Regional Communication Infrastructure Program, CARCIP. This initiative will provide connectivity to all government offices and schools in each country. Another issue that might be of interest occurred during this month. In Belize City, finalized the cycle of Central American and Caribbean Regional Frequency Coordination meetings on the use of the very high frequency band and the ultra high frequency band. This was the last of 4 meetings coordinated by the International Telecommunications Union ITU in collaboration with other organizations, which established the basis for formal frequency coordination intergovernment agreements for broadcasting and mobile services in the indicated bands. The director of ITU's Radio Communications Bureau, Mr. François Rancy, indicated the digital switchover enables the release of the digital dividend, the implementation of which is a major step in reducing the digital divide and probably involve the most important decision taken by regulators to ensure that mobile broadband is available to all populations at an affordable price. The output of these meetings facilitate the region's transition from analog to digital terrestrial television and the allocation of the digital dividend. This is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wanda. This was Wanda Perez with updates from the Caribbean region. Well, thank you, Grace, Wanda, and Sita for sharing the updates from your regions. That brings us to the end of our September briefings on IG. All developments mentioned by Stephanie, Marilia, Vlada are described on the observatory at dig.watch. One final announcement. This month's Geneva Digital Watch newsletter will also be available for download on dig.watch/newsletter. Thank you all for participating in today's briefing, and of course, see you all in October.